Joining us today for our closing plenary at Global Ghost and Regional Hauntologies, which is a joint international symposium run between Manchester Metropolitan University and our Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies and St Teresa's College in Kerala in India. So thank you to everybody who's worked on this event to put it together. So I'm going to introduce our second plenary of the symposium now. We're very grateful to our Go Global initiative here at Manchester Metropolitan University, to Caroline Collier and James Draper for generously funding this plenary session. So I'm going to introduce now Dr. Melissa Edmundson, who's a senior lecturer in English from Clemson University in the USA, who's joining us quite early in the morning. So thank you so much for that, Melissa. Welcome to the symposium. So probably Melissa needs no introduction for most of us. She's a famous face in Gothic studies who specialises in women's supernatural fiction. She's the author of two excellent monographs, Women's Ghost Literature in 19th-Century Britain, published by University of Wales Press in 2013, and Women's Colonial Gothic Writing, Haunted Empire, 1850 to 1930, which came out in 2018 from Palgrave. But you might also have come across her work as an anthologist. She's put so much work into making forgotten women writers, forgotten writers of colour back into public circulation. So she's edited some editions for Handheld Press, Women's Weird, Strange Stories by Women, and Women's Weird Too. Those are both fabulous collections. And she's also done single author editions on writers like D.K. Broster, Clotilde Graves, Eleanor Mordaunt, E. Nesbit, Charlotte Riddell, and Helen Daguri Simpson, and has a new one coming out on Violet Hunt soon with British Library Tales of the Weird. And she's also edited Alice Perrin's East of Suez for Victorian Secrets Press. So, you know, we're delighted to have you here with us today, Melissa. So I'll invite you to go ahead and share your slides. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your paper on Alice Kipling's Haunted Life.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, let's see here. There we go. Okay, everyone can see that.
Perfect.
The usual question. Okay, perfect. And let me make sure. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much to Emma and Matt for inviting me to speak here today. I'm excited to talk about Alex Trix Kipling, and the title I've chosen here is Haunted Life. And really throughout, she was involved in many different aspects of the supernatural. So as someone who has, spent her academic career recovering women writers who have been forgotten by literary historians and anthologists over the years, I'll start by saying something that I never thought that I would say, that I'm happy today to be talking about Kipling. But not that Kipling. Instead, I'd like to spend some time discussing the life and work of Kipling's sister, Alice. So in the spirit of this symposium, let me play on a quote from Derrida and say that there is Kipling and one must reckon with him. One cannot not have to. That is no doubt true, as his writings are ubiquitous in Anglo-Indian fiction, and for better or for worse, he remains a foundational name in British literature. But for today, let's put Rudyard in the background for once and focus on Alice. Okay, so Alice MacDonald Kipling was born on June 11th, 1868 in London. She was always known as Trix because, according to her cousin Florence MacDonald, as a young child, she was such a tricksy little thing. She was the daughter of John Lockwood Kipling and Alice MacDonald, one of the famous MacDonald sisters. And I have to just take a moment here. I found it sort of amusing and kind of sad that her mother here is Alice, so there's a little bit confusion. I will refer to her as Trix for the remainder of the talk. But if you notice, children one, Rudyard Kipling, but there's no mention at all of her daughter Alice. And here we have Alice on the right as a 4-year-old. So again, kind of disappearing here from history. So Trix spent a happy childhood in what was known then as Bombay until both she and Rudyard were taken back to England in 1871 and left with complete strangers, the Holloways. According to Trix's biographers, this was at the end of an extended family vacation in which the Kiplings visited several family members, all the while the siblings having no idea the true purpose of the trip. By all accounts, both children were miserable during this time and felt abandoned by their parents, particularly their mother. Trix returned to India in 1883, where she rejoined the Kipling household in Lahore. At this time, her father was the principal of the Mayo School of Industrial Art. Throughout their childhood, Trix and Rudyard remained close and had wonderful imaginations. They collaborated on projects such as you can see here, Echoes, published in 1884, Quartet, published in 1885, and Plain Tales from the Hills, published in 1886 through 7. According to Amardeep Singh, approximately 20 to 25% of the Plain Tales project bears the sensibility and influence of Alice, whether in stories attributed to her in the Civil and Military Gazette or in other stories attributed to Rudyard, in which a growing number of Kipling scholars see traces of Alice's aesthetic and themes. Trix married Jack Fleming in 1889 in Simla. He was 10 years older than she was and worked with the Survey of India. Trix's biographers have speculated that the marriage was not successful and was not really all that happy, and the couple did not have any children. Barbara Fisher states that in the first year of her marriage, instead of producing a child, Trix wrote and published a novel. This first novel was The Heart of a Maid and was published in 1891 under the pseudonym Beatrice Grange as part of the Indian Railway series. It is set in Anglo-India and tells of a young woman's unhappy experiences in marriage. Her second novel, A Pinchbeck Goddess, was published in 1897 under the name Mrs. J.M. Fleming and was an expanded version of an earlier story published in the Civil and Military Gazette as part of the Plain Tales from the Hills series. In 1901, Trix also collaborated with her mother on a volume of poetry titled Hand in Hand, Verses by a Mother and a Daughter. There is a listing for a third novel, Her Brother's Keeper, with Longman in 1901, but this novel cannot be located. It's possible that this title refers to a short story by the same name, published in Longman's magazine in 1902. Some of Trix's earliest writings were ghost stories. These stories show great promise, and it's really a shame that she didn't compose more of them. Written when she was just 17, The Haunted Cabin was published in Quartet in 1885. It draws on many traditional elements of the ghost story, while it also allows Trix to process her own difficult childhood and feelings of abandonment. Barbara Fisher claims that we have Rudyard to thank for this story because he encouraged Trix to write and publish it. In the opening paragraph, Trix signals to the reader her desire to experiment with the genre as she describes how the story differs from traditional ghost stories. There are ghosts of all ages and conditions, gray-haired ghosts and ghosts with golden locks, specters in shrouds, and apparitions in bridal array. but by common consent it would seem to have been agreed that all should be alike melancholy and awe-inspiring. Hollow groans herald the approach of some, the rattling of chains accompanies the march of others. A merry ghost who ran laughing down a corridor, or a mischievous ghost who peeped through a half-open door with smiling eyes, would not be counted as one of the true breed by any who had the slightest acquaintance with the class to which it claimed to belong. Who ever heard of a rosy, smiling specter, of a plump and dimpled ghost frolicking in the noonday sunshine? The story concerns a young mother and her 3-year-old son, Robbie, sailing back to India after a short visit to England. Though not mentioned directly, the trip seems to have been made for the health of the boy, as the narrator says that she is eager for her husband to, quote, see the improvement a few months have made in our Robbie. Likewise, the narrator makes a point to say that she too is in good health and excellent spirits, and therefore was not in a state of mind to be ready to conjure up imaginary terrors. Robbie begins seeing a little girl in their cabin, and the narrator initially thinks the girl is simply playing games by sneaking into the room. She describes her as a blue-eyed, yellow-haired, round-faced child who seemed to be about 4 years old. The child is seemingly full of life. She springs up when the woman sees her and looks at her with a mischievous smile. The woman also hears the child laugh while the quick patter of her feet run up and down the hall. Though initially dismissive of the girl's presence, the woman becomes more concerned about the possibility of a mother leaving her child to wander around the ship unchaperoned, only wearing her little nightgown and with bare feet. The narrative makes it clear that Robbie inherits his mother's ability to see ghosts because he is the only child on board who can see the little girl, who he calls a fairy. This is a nod to Trix's own psychic abilities, which I will be talking about in a little bit, which she inherited from her mother. Alice MacDonald and all of her sisters believed that they had the ability of second sight due to their Scottish heritage. In addition to the little girl, the woman is concerned about Robbie's safety as well. She says that the steamer was high in the water, so the ports and all the cabins were open wide. And I had an anxious time of it, cautioning my Robbie not to lean out of ours. Unbeknownst to her, this is the exact cause of the little girl's death. The woman goes to her cabin to rest and leaves Robbie in the care of an older girl. She makes a point of saying that this girl was old enough to look after him, again signaling her concern for her son. As she enters the cabin, she sees the little girl leaning out of the porthole. She cries out, startling the girl and causing her to lose her balance. As the girl falls from the window, the woman hears a short, stifled cry, which was more like a sob than a shriek. The woman cries out for help and is subsequently told the story of May Rodney, a little girl with blonde hair who fell out of the porthole of the same cabin 6 years ago. The stewardess says that while people frequently feel the presence of the ghostly child and occasionally see her, most of them don't experience what the woman sees and hears. We may at first think of this as a fairly traditional ghost story, and we can say that the story fits the pattern of many typical Anglo-Indian ghost stories written during the British colonial era. There is the inherent liminality of the ship voyage itself, which reflects how many British felt during the Raj period. For many, having spent years and often decades in British India, they were always somewhere kind of in between their home country of Great Britain and their adopted country of India. In the story, there is likewise the recurrent theme of colonial anxiety over children becoming sick or otherwise unwell in the supposedly harsh climate of India. The narrator makes it clear at the beginning of The Haunted Cabin that Robbie has had to return to England because of his health. Likewise, the abrupt, tragic death of May Rodney, a little girl almost the same age as Robbie and who stayed in the same cabin, suggests other dangers that children may encounter on the journey to and from India, as well as the myriad other dangers that supposedly awaited children on the subcontinent. However, looking at the story through the context of Trix Kipling's life, we can appreciate how she used the ghost story to exorcise some of her own personal demons. Like many children of British parents living in India, both Trix and Rudyard were taken back to England as young children and abandoned by their mother. This experience greatly affected both siblings. According to Barbara Fisher, Trix, at the age of 17, was not prepared to write directly about the misery of her childhood in fiction or memoir, nor was she prepared to cast blame for that misery. Through the ghost story, Trix was able to release some of this past trauma. As Fisher says, she believed herself to be a child who had been thrown away. In the story, there are two mothers. The little girl's mother seemingly lets her daughter run around the ship unsupervised, and subsequently the child dies because of a lack of parental supervision. When mothers are not there, children suffer. On the other hand, Robbie's mother constantly worries about the well-being of her son, and he remains safe. The narrator is also able to hear the short, stifled cry of the girl when others are not. In another sense, the ghostly girl is left behind by her mother and remains on the ship, always between, in a state of limbo, reenacting her terrible fate over and over again. This cycle of unresolved grief is another way, really, for Trix to describe her own troubled childhood. Kipling's second ghost story, and the only story she published under her own name, is titled At a Christmas Ball. Published in the Christmas edition of Black and White in 1892, the story is set in colonial India and once again concerns unexpected death and lost futures. The story begins with Connie Mayton, a pretty young woman described as slight and fair, who had not been long enough in India to lose her fresh English bloom, and her suitor, Ted Hastings, a lieutenant in the British artillery. Hastings asked Connie to save him 3 dances at next year's ball, while also promising to visit her in Simla on his next leave. After he departs, Connie is unsettled because his absence delays a marriage proposal. She is then shocked to read in the newspaper that Hastings has died of cholera on his way to Simla. The report claims that he must have contracted the disease during the journey, as the cantonment he had left was free from it. This statement returns to themes explored in The Haunted Cabin, as Kipling draws attention to the dangers of travel to and from and across the colonial empire. The newspaper report stresses what the loss of Hastings represents. He is said to be a promising and deservedly popular young officer, whose early death would cause regret to a large circle of friends. For Connie, his death represents a lost future of marriage and happiness. The loss affects Connie greatly, but she attends the ball the following year. She chooses to tie a bunch of white roses with black ribbon, which reminds her sister Ida of the promise Hastings made. Though her mother and sister say that she looks unwell, Connie insists on attending the ball and hides her dance program, which shows her continued connection to and memories of Ted Hastings. The narrator says, "No one could see that against the 7th, 8th, and 9th dances, she had written the name of a man who had been lying in his grave in the Umballa cemetery for 6 months." At the ball, Connie's sister is unsettled when she thinks she sees someone who looks like Hastings. Other people notice Connie, quote, walking around the ballroom alone, her fan and bouquet both held in her right hand, and her head inclined a little towards the left, as though she was listening and looking up at someone. Connie remains in a shadowy corner of the room, and when another man approaches asking for a dance and then attempts to sit next to her, she pushes him away. Then, seeing that the chair is empty, Connie faints. The guests think little of it, as Kipling humorously notes that someone always faints at a big ball. It is a contingency that is provided for. As they leave, Ida sees a tall, slender man who stood in the shadow, apart from the others, holding a white bouquet. The final paragraph returns to the fear of child death in India and the anxiety of those who die there being forgotten. In Ambala the following morning, a Mrs. Collin goes to the cemetery to put a New Year's wreath on her baby's grave, a gesture that points to grief and remembrance, as well as to the idea of new beginnings in the new year and those who will never have such beginnings. As she looks at Hastings' grave, she tells her husband that she was glad to see that his grave had not been forgotten. Someone has left a bouquet of white roses tied with black ribbon. However, there is an added layer of sadness here because we know that no living person has visited the grave. Like the haunted cabin, this story was influenced by events in Trix's life. She was fond of telling the story of a young soldier who pledged himself to her after dancing with Trix at a ball. He later was transferred to Burma, where he was killed in an attack on a fort. Trix's niece, Margaret E. MacDonald, who, as a little side note, inherited Trix's crystal ball and fortune-telling cards, shared memories of her aunt's second sight. She recalled one supernatural event which has similarities with the story's theme of lost love and ghostly returns. She says, Aunt Trix was walking through a large cemetery in Edinburgh and heard some music. She stopped, listened, and looked to see where it was coming from, but there was no house or building of any kind near enough for her to hear any music. She knew the music well, and then realized that the last time she had heard it was at a dance in India many years previously. She remembered exactly with whom she was dancing at the time, and to her surprise, when she looked down at a nearby grave, she found it was that of her dancing partner all those years ago. She had completely lost touch with him and had no idea he was dead or that he had any connection with Edinburgh. Trix suffered a mental breakdown in 1898 and returned for a time to her parents' home in England. Unfortunately for her, and for future generations of readers who would really have enjoyed the work of such a promising writer, this event all but ended her career in fiction. Barbara Fisher notes that before the breakdown, Trix had been full of ideas for novels and stories, but afterwards these had simply slipped away. Fisher goes on to say, from time to time, she recalled with some pride how she had once submitted her work to publishers, dealt competently with editors, and gloried in seeing her work in print. And instead of returning to writing, she revived her interest in the psychic world. As she grew older, Trix became increasingly interested in psychic phenomena. She became aware of her abilities after reading Frederick Meyer's Human Personality and its Survival of Bodily Death, published in 1903. While writing letters to friends, Trix would suddenly start composing messages to people completely unknown to her. When she would try to resist this impulse by leaving her desk and even taking up needlework or knitting instead, her hand would involuntarily make the motion of writing in the air. Both her husband and her brother disapproved of Trix pursuing these abilities. They thought that these psychic interests led to her periods of mental illness and depression. For this reason, Trix kept her correspondence and writings for the Society for Psychical Research private by using the pseudonym Mrs. Holland. Other members of the family found these abilities to be quite memorable. Her niece, Helen MacDonald, described how Trix had a habit of leaving her body at night to visit friends. She even saw Rudyard Kipling in his last moments while she was in Edinburgh and he was in a hospital in London. Her cousin, Florence MacDonald, said that from early girlhood she saw ghosts or spirits, and in her later years the gift developed considerably, so that she was able to converse with many who had passed into the spirit world. After reading Myers's book, Trix contacted Alice Johnson, the SPR secretary, research officer, and eventual editor of the Society's journal. In an account published in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research in 1908, Trix stressed that her abilities were involuntary and were often accompanied by severe headaches. I have felt on other occasions that some unseen but very present personality was striving to transmit a message through me to a well-beloved. In every case, the communication was utterly unsought by me and came as a complete surprise to the recipient, who was always a recent acquaintance, never one of my friends. My attention was always enforced, as it were, by a severe pain in the head, which vanished when I had delivered the message. She told Johnson, "My own people hate what they call uncanniness, and I am obliged to hide from them the keen interest I cannot help feeling in psychic matters. I have never been in surroundings that encourage this interest. I have never been mesmerized. I have never attended a seance. But the idea of anything connected with paid mediumship is particularly disagreeable to me. I only discovered by accident 5 years ago that I have the clairvoyant faculty." Johnson conducted experiments that paired Trix with other mediums, most notably Margaret Verrill, who was a psychical researcher, medium, and lecturer in classics at Newnham College, and the American trance medium Leonora Piper. They were known for their ability to do cross correspondence. This was the theory that two people with mediumistic abilities would each separately receive fragments of messages from a supernatural source, and when combined, the message would then be complete. From September 1903 to January 1904, Trix sent Johnson her written messages. Trix traveled back to England in the fall of 1905, ostensibly to visit family, but met Johnson in person. This led to another series of experiments before Trix returned to India the following year. In 1908, Jack Fleming retired from military service, and the couple returned to Britain, settling in Edinburgh, a place that Trix really didn't like. She much preferred to be kind of in the hustle and bustle of London. During this time, Trix continued her automatic writing and frequently met with Alice Johnson. Barbara Fisher describes these writings as a kind of therapy for Trix, saying that in India, she had been surrounded by people, including her husband, who offered her little intellectual stimulation or affirmation. They failed to notice her gifts, praise her efforts, or make use of her energy and enthusiasm, while the members of the society respected and esteemed her efforts. Here was an audience who appreciated her talents. Trix produced hundreds of pages of automatic writing for the SPR, and even became a medium for the departed spirit of Frederick Myers himself. She went on, she was very able to kind of contact these, supposed spirits, and not only Myers, but she was also supposedly able to contact another SPR founder, that of Edmund Gurney, and may have seen his ghost on at least two different occasions. Alice Johnson published the following excerpt of a letter dated December 19, 1905, by Mrs. Holland, that describes an apparition recently seen by her as follows. On Wednesday evening, December 13th, at 9:30, my father was out, and I had just put my mother to bed, when I came briskly into a small and very brightly lighted room. I saw the figure of a very tall, thin man, dressed in gray, standing with his back to the fire. He had a long face, I think a mustache, certainly no beard, and suggested young middle age. But at my second step forward, he was gone. I had been thinking only of a business letter I was about to answer, and could not explain the tall, gray figure at all. I have seen nothing of this kind since 1901. Johnson remained skeptical of these supposed ghost sightings, thinking instead that they were caused by Trix's subliminal consciousness, kind of recalling things that she had been told in the past. But Trix was adamant that she could see these spirits. Johnson also shared samples of Trix's writing, which came in the form of verse. And here is one example. I whom he loved am a ghost, wandering weary and lost. I dare not dawn on his sight, wind-blown weary and white. He would shudder in hopeless fright, he who loved me the best. I shun the paths he will go, because I should frighten him so, weary and lacking rest. I whom he loved am a shade, making mortals afraid. Yet all that was vile in me, the garb of mortality, my body that used to be, is mouldering out of sight. I am but a waiting soul, pain purified, seeking its goal. Why should he dread the sight? If I showed him my white bones under the churchyard stones, or the creatures that creep and rest on what was once my breast, he who loved me the best would have good cause for fright. But my face is only pale, my form like a wind-blown veil. Why should he dread the sight? Should I beat on the window pane, he would think it the wind and rain. If he saw my pale face gleam, he would dream it a stray moonbeam, or the waft of a passing dream. No thought for the lonely dead, buried away out of sight. And I go from him veiling my head, wind-blown weary and white. These lines are indicative of the inner feelings Trix herself felt. Barbara Fisher says that while, many of these scripts, are kind of poetic, and we can maybe think about that as almost kind of 19th century Gothic, that they also really conveyed her old yearning to be heard and understood. In other instances, these writings were connected to Trix's supposed clairvoyance. During a trip to Italy, the urge to write suddenly came to her and produced the following lines. Under the orange tree, who is it lies? Baby hair that is flaxen fair, shines when the dew on the grass is wet. Under the iris and violet, 'neath the orange tree, where the dead leaves be, look at the dead child's eyes. When one of her friends saw what she had written, they confirmed that there was a local story about a child being buried in the garden, though Trix had never heard the story. Once both her husband and brother had died, Trix was much more open about her psychic abilities. In October 1945, the Kipling Journal published a letter by Trix in which she shared some of her supernatural experiences. She recalled that once a deceased child shared a message with her that she was then able to relay to the child's mother. During the Second World War, she was also able to help a Polish soldier stationed in Scotland by telling him that his mother would recover from her illness. She even convinced a skeptical Polish bishop who decided to test her abilities. He gave her an iron key, saying that no one knew what it opened besides himself. She slept with the key under her pillow and dreamed about a hidden box with sacred relics in a church. These messages and visions helped her earn the title of the Lady Who Knows Everything. In later life, Trix became a member of the Edinburgh Psychic College, where, according to Florence MacDonald, she taught yoga to the members. She also liked to spend time at the Edinburgh Zoo, where she spoke to the elephants and hippos in Hindustani. After her brother's death, Trix was involved in the Kipling Society, where she helped to cement her brother's reputation as an author before her own death in 1948. In a short remembrance of Trix in the April 1949 issue of the Kipling Journal, Rudyard Kipling's biographer Hilton Brown found it lamentable that no one had taken the time to talk to Trix and create what would have been a shining record of two interwoven and outstanding lives, her own and her brother's. He continues by saying, "Of her personal charm, I need say nothing. It is sufficiently known to many readers of these words. Like her gaiety and her common sense, it did not flag. How, then, was she not better known? Perhaps she was overshadowed always by her brother. One feels at any rate that her contemporaries did not make all of her that should have been made." It is indeed more than a little ironic that while Trix was working to ensure future generations read the work of her brother, she herself was being forgotten. However, in more recent years, Trix's life and work have been rediscovered. So Lorna Lee's Trix, as you can see here, the cover on the left, Trix, Kipling's Forgotten Sister, was published in 2004 and really is a treasure trove of unpublished manuscripts and typescripts collected by Lee. In 2024, Barbara Fisher published Trix, the Other Kipling, which you can see here on the right. This is the first full-length biography of Trix Kipling and will hopefully lead to more work on her in the coming years. Another very accessible and detailed digital resource is Amardeep Singh's The Kiplings and India, a collection of writings from British India, 1870 to 1900, published through Lehigh University in the US. And I wanted to kind of replicate what the homepage for this looks like. And actually, on the bottom, hopefully everyone can see that, is the website. But if you type in, the Kiplings in India, you should be able to hopefully find that. So highly recommended. And just another little sample here from that website. It has the digital editions of these early works, and you can see here it's really nice and very searchable. And the names are included here, so you see which ones that Trix contributed and which ones Rudyard contributed. So I highly recommend this, and it's very, very accessible. Okay, so Trix's life was also reimagined in Kipling and Trix, a novel written by Mary Hamer in 2012. In a June 2013 interview, Hamer said, "Who knew that he even had a sister? Rudyard Kipling, the man with the mustache and pebble glasses, the one who wrote the Jungle Book." Trix Kipling's work also achieved fame, but only when she wrote under a false name. When I began to pay attention to Trix, I found that the story of her life was more gripping than any fiction she managed to publish. But I think what makes Trix such an interesting person is that her writing and her life go so well together. Her early stories should definitely be added to the canon of Anglo-Indian ghost stories and should be read alongside those of her brothers. And not only did she contribute to psychical research in the early decades of the 20th century through hundreds of pages of automatic writing, but throughout her life, she was an avid letter writer. As a young woman, she recorded daily life in colonial India and continued telling stories to family and friends after her death. Her novels are likewise quite modern in how they dissect women's frequent unhappiness in marriage, their frustrated hopes and feelings of unfulfillment. She often felt misunderstood by those closest to her, her mother, her brother, and her husband. But through the supernatural, be it ghost stories, automatic writing, or second sight, Trix channeled her own personal ghost into writing, and in so doing, found her own unique voice. Thank you very much. And let me stop my share. Hopefully that'll pop me back up. Yeah.
Thank you
Okay.
so much, Melissa. Thank you. You know, I'm sure everyone agree, really rich, wide-ranging paper and showing that you've done it again. You've rescued one of these women from history who has so many interesting things to say about the supernatural. And, you know, I love to hear about her automatic writing and how she was sort of engaging with all those debates of her period about the occult. So do take the time, people here, to write in the chat, to think of your questions. We do have a couple in here already from people who are listening. So I think we might sort of dive in straight away with Krista's question, if that's okay. And you should be able to see these, Melissa, if you want to have a quick look in the chat as well.
Yeah.
So
I'm awful about keeping up with the chat as I'm talking. So yeah, let me go kind of back. Yeah, help me kind of work through this. Yeah.
Yeah. We've just got 2 or 3 questions so far, but sometimes it's helpful to see them on the side, isn't it? So let's start off with this question from Krista. What are your thoughts on why so many imperialists whose families were engaged directly in colonization ended up involved in the spiritualism movement? So great question.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that it seems like you know, especially for Trix, it was a little bit maybe a form of escape for her. She, you know, sort of, let's say, kind of was trapped in the role of, you know, kind of, you know, military spouse. And, you know, as a young girl, she really, there's these wonderful accounts of her, you know, kind of enjoying socialization and going to balls. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to definitely show that photograph of her looking like she was dressed for a ball. And she just loved to socialize. And, you know, even Rudyard to some extent told her at times to kind of tone it down and, you know, not, you know, kind of flirt with the men. And, you know, then she marries a husband who's, you know, Jack Fleming, I think they were a little bit mismatched. He really didn't kind of like to go out much. And I think for Trix that the automatic writing, you know, the spirit world, the psychic phenomena was sort of a way for her to escape kind of the dullness, I think, of her life after marriage. And then she makes those frequent trips back to England. You know, her parents move back after Lockwood, you know, retires. And, you know, she goes back and, you know, tells her husband that she's visiting, you know, her family, but actually it gives her a chance to see Alice Johnson in London. So I think that, you know, Trix, I think she really enjoyed her younger years in India and really, you know, really studied the culture and sort of soaked it up, you know, learned Hindustani and things like that. But I think that that psychical work really did kind of give her a chance to, you know, kind of escape the drudgery of you know, married life. So I hope I didn't shift off too much on the focus there.
No, I think you're definitely right. And you know, that sort of Anglo-Indian marriage is really sort of significant context, isn't it, for how we might frame her. So the next question from Snoo Hashish, I hope I'm saying that correctly, who says they've been working on the concept of super belief. a form of conviction that exceeds empirical verification and shapes an individual's perception of reality. So in that context, do you think Trix's reported psychic abilities and interest in spiritual phenomenon can be read as expressions of a super belief that challenges or transcends Victorian rationalism?
Oh, that's a really interesting idea. I have to look that up and read more about that super belief. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that um, it's so interesting that both in both biographies by Lorna Lee and Barbara Fisher, they talk about how Jack Fleming and Rudyard Kipling really did not want Trix to pursue this, psychic work. So again, linking back, she had to kind of keep it a secret, and from Jack, I think he knew, but they definitely didn't want her, and they felt that it really brought on these periods of, mental unwellness
Mm.
and a little bit of instability. But, as Barbara Fisher says, it really was like a type of therapy. That's the word that Fisher uses. It was like a type of therapy for her, to have something to do and to live an intellectual life, and, to pursue this belief, super belief that she had in her abilities, and she really did, believe in them. Um, and really, the two times that I didn't, for the sake of time, I didn't cover, she really had two kind of times of where you would almost, classify it as a mental breakdown. Once in 1898, and some people have speculated that was because of a rather unhappy, maybe unfulfilled marriage, intellectually unfulfilled. And then later, about 10 years later, um, her parents died very close to one another.
Mhm.
And as understandably, this would really affect someone like that. But both Jack and Rudyard, around that time, she was doing the automatic writing, and they blamed it on the, automatic writing and, second sight and seeing these spirits, when in reality it was, the death of the parents. So I think that really, again, this idea of belief, it's how she really formed a sense of self. It's just unfortunate, as Mary Hamer says, most of her writings were under the assumed name of Mrs. Holland. But
Mm.
she herself knew it, I think, and gained a sense of importance, of being needed and being creative in this way, in this, guise of Mrs. Holland. But super
Mm.
belief, that's a really interesting concept. Thank you. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I'm going to look that up too.
Yeah.
So if we stay with this sort of spiritualism idea here, we've got another question from Sarah, who was talking about
Mm.
spiritualism in the previous session we were in. So asking again about automatic writing. Does this reveal something about the hidden, feminized labor of channeled or collaborative authorship? The medium as passive vessel, and suggesting a comparison with Florence Marryat, who I know you've written about in Women's Colonial Gothic. So could you say a little bit about that for us?
Yeah. Again, I think that idea of, hidden, and I can see it here, the hidden feminized labor, yeah, channeled by, these, again, the work that she's doing is largely under this, pseudonym of Mrs. Holland. Um, and, she was, everyone talked about how Mrs. Holland did all these amazing things, but I think that it's sort of interesting to think about her, channeling, in some ways too, channeling these important men of the SPR, right? And she
Mm.
was the medium for Frederick Myers and Edmund Gurney. And she said that she was more interested in Frederick Myers for some reason, than Edmund Gurney. But, again, kind of I think that's maybe another way to think about it, as, passive, as kind of, she becomes a voice for others. So even though, yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it makes me think about that differently. She's able to kind of build a sense of identity for herself. She is always channeling, these other people and these other men through these automatic writings. Um, But, it's also so interesting to think about. One of the reasons why I wanted to read a little bit of that long example, it just seems like that's Trix kind of coming through in some interesting ways as well about, weary and not being seen, and not being kind of included, all of that kind of fits in as well. So, but that's an interesting, I'll have to think a little bit more about that. That's a really interesting comparison to Florence Marriott. I hadn't
Mm.
really made that connection.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, so Matt is asking, is there evidence of a close relationship between Trix and her nephew, John Kipling, to bring in another member of the family?
That's interesting. I'll have to look into that a little bit more. The biographies don't talk too much about um, of the nephew. They really focus. She had a really close relationship with her nieces. Um, so Florence and Margaret, the McDonald side of the family.
Mm.
There's a lot more written about them, and they really have fond memories. That's an interesting question. I haven't seen as much being written about her relationship with her nephew. So something definitely to look into, but it's kind of interesting. Again, maybe sorry about this going in a different direction. It's really interesting to think about, and maybe even going up to that, previous question of, this idea of feminine, of gender. The men in her life tended to, disregard, tell her, don't do, the automatic writing, it makes you mentally unwell, it makes you physically unwell. Her husband, her brother, while the women in her life, her nieces in particular, really had these wonderful memories of her, doing, these readings. And I said crystal ball. It's kind of like a little egg shape. That was her crystal ball. And she had, tarot cards and she would do readings. So her nieces really, really kind of enjoyed. So a little bit she was able to kind of open up to them. Her mother, Alice, was really kind of frightened. Trix writes about her being very frightened of the ability and not really wanting to, kind of give into it. So it's kind of interesting how the family, sorry, I can't really answer your question very well, but the
Mhm.
family kind of splits, I think, where the women are a little bit more supportive of those abilities
Mm.
by and large. So
Mm.
yeah, I'll have to look into
Definitely.
that though. Yeah.
Mhm. So I wanted to ask something, if it's okay, about child burial. I'm interested in burial at the moment, but I
Yeah.
know that you talked about that, I think, in the context of this fear of child death in India. And I was wondering about whether that becomes part of the one of those, really resonant fears of the Anglo-Indian ghost story, because was it because like women were fearing that they would, sort of be moved between India and Europe, sort of against their will almost, or they might have to leave the dead child behind almost and not be able to grieve. Is that something that you notice across Anglo-Indian ghost stories?
Yeah, I mean, and that brings up an interesting point where, I mean, historically, many children were brought back to England, but then didn't get well. So
Mm.
that's really interesting. They were then buried and left in Britain. And, the family would have to return,
Mm.
to India. So that is interesting. But I think the haunted cabin, what makes that so interesting as well is, May Rodney, the little girl, is not buried, right? She
Mm.
she falls out of the porthole, the window on the ship, and that's it. She doesn't have a burial.
Of
So that's
course.
really interesting to think about as well, that she really is lost. That
Mm.
they're like the mother in the second story at a Christmas ball, and it's really just the last, little paragraph, who visits her child's grave to put, the New Year's commemorative wreath. Um, she has a grave to return to and remember, but May's mother, on the other hand, doesn't even have that. So that's a really interesting idea. But there are many examples. Um, Alice Perrin
Yeah.
has, several, I'm just thinking off the top of
Yeah.
my head, has several examples of, children who, you know, die sometimes pretty horrific, deaths,
Mm.
sometimes, not accidental in some cases. And, that fear and that anxiety was there in a lot of stories. Florence Marriott, Little White Souls is another almost novella that talks there's some problematic aspects of that story, but also talks about child death. So it really is a big recurrent, theme. Bethia Mary Croker has a story where a young woman dies of cholera. So again, that fear and that anxiety. But I think it goes a lot deeper too, of saying, deep down, the British don't belong there, right? That they shouldn't be in India. And I think that maybe indirectly that was a way for these authors to explore, that critique.
No, I think you're right. And thank you for all those references. I was certainly thinking of Alice Perrin, but it seems to be maybe a wider phenomenon. So I think there's probably just time for one more question as we're sort of bringing this to a close. So there's a question from Ananya. Do you think Kipling's writing was influenced by her childhood stories and experiences more than what she saw through her eyes?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make as well, that, I think India really did shape her. She was glad to be back with the family in the early 80s when she, completes her schooling and goes back. And the family, they referred to themselves as the family square, I believe. So we had, Alice and John Lockwood Kipling, and then they had, Alice and Trix and Rudyard. They really were happy as that family unit. But yeah, so much that defines her is being it's interesting. It's being separated from India, I think, because she absolutely loved being in India as a little girl. And then when, Rudyard and Trix are taken back and then left with these, and the biographers even were not really, sure why they were left with this family when they had several relatives, many MacDonald sisters, but they were left with these complete strangers. That's really interesting that the absence really does define, I think, Trix, that early trauma. Like I said, she writes about it. Those ghost stories are very much processing her own trauma. The automatic writings are, writing about this weary ghost, but it can be read as, Trix herself. Wanting to be heard, wanting these messages to come through. So I think that can be a really kind of interesting way of thinking about it. But yeah, definitely being defined by India and also being defined by, the absence from India and the absence from the family. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That seems like a really great way to be ending, to think of that idea of being defined by India, but being defined by the absence from India, which has sort of brought, together some of the different strands of the sessions I've been listening to earlier on. So can I say thank you so much, Melissa, for your fabulous paper, for sharing your research so generously on Trix, and and giving us lots more things to think about. So I'm sure everyone will join us in thanking you so much for a great paper. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. Yes. And hopefully I've inspired more people to go check out those biographies. And both of the ghost stories, I should just give a quick shout out, are available in the website through Lehigh University, Amardeep Singh's website. So yeah, do go check those out in her other writings. She also wrote a fair amount of poetry. So yeah, please go and check out more of Trix's writing.
Yeah, definitely. And it is really useful that you've shared those resources. I think people have appreciated that, and the way we access, some of these forgotten stories, and it is really, really helpful for us all to see that. So I just wanted to start to bring the event to a close now. We have recorded this talk. We will edit it so it won't capture anybody else's voices. So if you missed the beginning or any of it, you'll be able to catch up on that later on.